Joining us now, NBC News special correspondent Tom Brokaw, veteran columnist and MSNBC contributor Mike Barnicle, and award-winning author and NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss.
Tom Brokaw tried to explain to Americans who weren't alive at the time just what John Glenn's moment in history meant in 1962.
Well, for my generation, I was 22 at the time when he went up, and we were coming of age in the Kennedy era, which was can-do, but there had been a lot of catastrophes on the launch pad, and we didn't know what was going to happen. I've been with John down at the capsule itself, and I'm telling you, the little smart cars that you see around New York, those are limousines compared to what he rode around the country in 3 different cycles. And the part that really interests me the most, on re-entry, they were worried about the heat shield coming loose, and he could hear the straps flapping as they were coming back in. They said that was the only time when his heart rate spiked a little bit, but he made it back in.
Wow.
He was the coolest, most modest customer you can possibly imagine. I think if Norman Rockwell were drawing the quintessential American hero, it would be John Glenn. Small town Ohio, marries his, not just his high school sweetheart, but somebody he met in a crib next to him when he was a young man. Goes on to serve in 2 wars, becomes a senator, and it was always modest about whatever his accomplishments were. We were in, I've been at Ohio State at his College for Public Affairs, which they've established out there, and a lot of people didn't know this. The last time I went 2 years ago, I walked in and he said, "I have molecular degeneration. I can't see as well as I once did," and it was heartbreaking because his vision had been 20/20 until he was like 88.
Wow.
Michael Beschloss, talk about the importance to Americans, to the U.S. government, what John Glenn did, and how America stopped for those moments when he took off and then was up in space.
Yeah, America did, and it was because it was not only just an act of personal, enormous heroism and courage, but at the moment, John Glenn seemed to be the guy who was winning the Cold War, because John Kennedy was making the argument, we had to get to the moon before the Russians, and if we did not, we were in big danger of losing the Cold War. And when Glenn went up in February of 1962, Gagarin and Titov, these Soviet cosmonauts had gone up. We had not made an orbital flight. Suddenly Glenn did. And John Kennedy, being a great politician, said, I'm going to use him for politics. He said, Glenn can't go on any more missions because he's too great a hero. We can't risk him. And he and Bobby went to Glenn and said, you've got to go into politics. So when John Kennedy went to Dallas in November of 1963, they had planned for Glenn to run for the Senate in Ohio the next year. And of course, when Glenn announced a couple of months later John Kennedy was gone, had been assassinated, and that was his first race, I think Kennedy hoped that John Glenn would be on a Democratic ticket in some way in 1968.
Hey, Mike Barnicle, Mika touched on a little bit, but Glenn's service in World War II in Korea, and his wingman there was the greatest hitter in the history of the world, Ted Williams. Talk a little about their relationship.
Well, that's right, Willie. And Ted Williams had always said that if he had not been the greatest hitter who ever lived, he would have stayed in the Marine Corps and been the greatest fighter pilot the Marine Corps ever had. But John Glenn's life was a trajectory of the American story, the ultimate American story. World War II, Korea, one of the 7 original Mercury astronauts, as Tom and Michael have pointed out, a truly humble guy. They had a night for Ted Williams in Boston in 1988. John Glenn was there along with Joe DiMaggio, several other icons. And Glenn was electric in just his appearance, but he never articulated anything about what he had done or who he was. But as both Michael and Tom pointed out, when that rocket ship sailed into the stratosphere and around the globe in February of 1962, America still was not out of the doldrums of the 50s and the post-war sag that occurred in this country in terms of morale. You'd had the Bay of Pigs in the early hours of the Kennedy administration, the Berlin Wall, but John Glenn and what he did that day and with his entire life was a true statement about what it is to be an American.